One of the conflicts from the War of 1812 that was created within the United States, the political conflicts between Federalists and Republicans, and even within the Federalist Party, the factions that eventually broke up the Federalist Party, created really a new atmosphere, right? The Republicans are going to be split into national Republicans that are a little bit of a balance in between Republicans, Jefferson Republicans, and Federalists. And then the second Republican Party is the Jeffersonian Republican. So you have the National Republican and the Jeffersonian Republican, and then you have the Federalists that eventually, as you see through the different political development, will eventually end their tenure as leading political party, and you really see the emergence of these Republicans, both national and Jeffersonian. But even though the Federalist Party was ending and its beliefs in the Constitution were were kind of ending, you do see those beliefs live on in the hands of John Marshall, Supreme Court Chief Justice, assigned in 1801 by assigned in 1801, eventually being in the position till 1822, eventually influencing till 1835, reminding you that under the Article 3 of the Constitution, the Supreme Court Justice or the Supreme Court Justices have lifelong terms, so they don't have a set amount of terms. They can retire, they can quit, or they eventually leave the office until they are dead. So that's the power of the justice, right? And the powers within that the Supreme Court has, or the justices have, is that, remember, they're the ones who have the power to interpret laws, so they can decide whether a law is constitutional or unconstitutional. So within John Marshall's powers, he's able to preserve a Federalist mentality. And remember that Federalist, if you go back to the first faction, right, Federalists versus Republicans, it's state, strong central government, weak central government. And so while the Republicans had taken office in Congress and in the executive branch, now you still have one very powerful branch still being Federalists. And so the Supreme Court at the time had his Chief Justice, so the guy who's running the Supreme Court, as a Federalist, but then you had also national Republicans who are more on the side of Federalists than on the side of Jeffersonian Republicans. So a couple instances that challenge, right, the power is, one is the McCulloch versus Maryland, where the United States sets up a second national bank, and it gives the power to the national bank to establish branches throughout the states. One of those branches is established in Baltimore, Maryland, which eventually competed with the Maryland banks, public banks. And what you see is that the Maryland banks are going to file a lawsuit that, well, in the lawsuit, they're eventually taxing the national bank, but under Marshall, he eventually rejects that notion and says that Maryland does not have the power tax to tax the national bank branches, and so he asserts the national power, the federal power, the centralized power, by taking away that power from Maryland. Another example of the power Marshall had is demonstrated in Section 1 under Mayberry versus Madison, where he says the court does not have the power to enforce a law, but it does have the power to review and interpret a law, therefore establishing judicial review. Having the Supreme Court review laws made by Congress or by the executive branch gives the power to eventually, ultimately, striking down laws under or calling them unconstitutional. So he eventually is asserting his power in various examples. And so basically, he's trying to protect the property rights of the individual. That's his notion. And so he really lives by these three principles, right? Judicial authority, supremacy of the natural law, and traditional property rights. So he's a federalist aided by national Republicans who are more sympathetic to the Federalist in his court. And so, therefore, while the Federalist Party may have ended and is losing power more and more, he is going to assert Federalist ideology for decades because he is the Supreme Court justice. In contrast to the Federalist ideologies of his father, John Quincy Adams actually had more Republican ideologies. Remember, his father was the second president of the United States, John Adams. And so John Quincy Adams has a huge impact on American government. First, by being the architect of the Treaty of Ghent, and then serving as the Secretary of State for James Monroe. He eventually he orchestrates this new ideology on a new take on foreign policy known as a Monroe Doctrine. Something to know is that doctrines are very popular in the 1900s. In the 20th century, we see the Truman Doctrine, we see the Nixon Doctrine, we see the Reagan Doctrine, Eisenhower Doctrine. So one of the things that you will see is that he eventually ushers in a new era of foreign policy. So the biggest thing that comes about in the James Monroe presidency is the Monroe Doctrine, where the United States eventually established itself as a supreme power on the Western Hemisphere, basically saying to all European powers that the Western Hemisphere, which includes North America and South America, are not open for colonization. Especially because during this time, in the early to mid 1800s, you see the independence movement in Latin America. While these new countries have achieved their independence, the United States kind of blankets them over this idea that they are under the protection of the United States. And so, while we'll see in the future is more party division, more the creation of more factions in our politics.